Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another great show for you today. I am again joined by my friend Niall Stanage, who is here to help me deliver the report on all the news going on in our great country.
The news and all the perspective, and there's a lot of it. Happy Thursday, Robby.
Happy Thursday.
I hope you're doing well, and why don't you get us started with telling us what is on your radar?
Here we go. Well, we're going to check in with Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, and the 2024 running mate of Vice President Kamala Harris, who recently admitted in an interview his role on the ticket was to set white guys at ease and make them feel like they could vote for Kamala Harris, a progressive black woman, because Walz knows white guy code. That was the line. Let's watch this clip.
I knew I was on the ticket. I would argue because we did a lot of amazing progressive things in Minnesota that improved people's lives. But I also was on the ticket, quite honestly, because I could code talk to white guys watching football, fixing their truck, doing that I could put them at ease. I was the permission structure to say, look, you can do this and vote for this.
I was on the ticket, quite honestly, because I could code talk to white guys watching football and fixing their truck. That's the quote. Now, Walz also admits that it didn't work because the Harris-Walz ticket wasn't able to win enough of those voters, those white guys whose language Tim Walz understands. Now, the remarks prompted a lot of derision on social media yesterday. The clumsy phrase code talk was trending on X. Walz made it sound like he spoke some secret language of white dudes. The Spectator's Stephen Miller wonders, why do Dems need to talk in code to white dudes to begin with? I think that's the issue there. And Chris Arnand points out that viewing it as a kind of secret language, saying you can code talk, mean there's a 98% chance people will see through your fake BS. That's what he said. So I have some thoughts on this as well, from one white dude, me, Robby Soave, to another, Tim Walz. Look, Tim, if that's the reason you were on the ticket, first and foremost, well, I had to say, you're a DEI hire. Now, look, I understand the presidential ticket often takes into account gender and race and formerly geography, as it can be important to have a veep who's from one of the states you need to win. In our electoral system, not all the states are equally important. Still, if your main qualification is that you're supposedly appealing to a specific identity group, I think it's just not a good sign. That's because the interests of identity groups, to the extent identity groups even have shared interests, are not necessarily just to get someone who superficially resembles them into a position of power. It's not like all black women love Kamala Harris, and if they do love her, it's not simply because she's herself a black woman. That's a very reductionist way of doing politics, frankly. One of the Democratic Party's progressive elites are absolutely in love with doing politics this way, but it just doesn't have the greatest track record. Now, I could call out Republicans for the same thing, by the way. When John McCain added Sarah Palin to the ticket in 2008, it was transparently because he was seeking a woman, not necessarily to appeal to female voters, but to make the ticket more interesting, historically groundbreaking, visually appealing, etc. And we know how that turned out. Turned out she was perhaps not the most qualified person for that job. So that's issue number one I have with what Waltz said. But issue number two is probably even more glaring and fundamental. Now, Waltz could code talk, he said he could code talk to white dudes because he likes watching football and fixing trucks. Think about that for just 1 minute. Is it really only white dudes who like watching football and fixing trucks? Now, to be clear, those are predominantly dude interests. They're just not white dude interests, as far as I know. Race has nothing to do with it. Black guys watch football, fix trucks. Increasingly, race actually is being depolarized in our society. It's a good thing. It's not necessarily to the Dems' advantage, however. Trump actually did shockingly well with young male voters of color. The point is that Democrats are not struggling with a particular racial demographic. What they are struggling with is men of any race, and particularly young men. Now, I was reminded of that yesterday when we were talking about Decision Desk HQ's latest poll results for Trump. The gender gap is as wide as it's ever been. Far more men approve of Trump than do women. This matters because Waltz is still hung up on the idea that the Democratic Party needs to be able to message more effectively to white people. The problem is broader than that. The party needs to message more effectively to men in general, not white men, men. For so long, progressive elites have been so obsessed with race, I think it's hard for them to talk about anything else, even though the salient factor here, young males.
So I think there's there's a few points here, Robby.
It's a good conversation for us two white dudes to have.
Exactly, we're well placed to talk from our lived experience in this one. No, I think that there is, the argument I think that Waltz is making is that Kamala Harris as a black woman was portrayed, certainly in more culturally and politically conservative quarters, as being part of a kind of cultural elite. And he was being brought in as someone who could more talk to voters in the heartland. It is worth noting, and you raised this in your radar, actually Kamala Harris's problem was not with white voters, with whom she did almost identically to President Biden 4 years previously. And in fact, she did very similarly with black voters as well. The key issues were Latino voters, where she fared significantly worse, voters without college degrees, with whom she again fared worse, and young voters. So it's hard to know whether you make the argument that, oh, well, Tim Waltz worked then, he shored up, or whether they were looking at the wrong problem. Also, though, when it comes to the kind of mockery that you weren't engaging in, but there was some stuff online, it does seem to me that whatever the validities of some of those criticisms, there's often a situation where Democrats are criticized whatever they are perceived to represent culturally. AOC can be disregarded because she was a bartender, but Elizabeth Warren can be disregarded because she's a former Harvard Law professor. Tim Waltz can be disregarded because he's this Midwestern white dude, but Kamala Harris is a black woman coastal elite. Chuck Schumer can be disregarded because he's too weak and too part of the establishment. Jasmine Crockett can be discarded because she's too anti-establishment and militant, or Ilhan Omar, the same thing. So if you're not liberal, that's fine. You can oppose people on their views. But sometimes I think these are just bad faith arguments, trying to discard or disregard people because of identity in a way that's just a bit fraudulent, because Democrats can't win in that respect.
Oh, no, I agree with you. If you're focusing on personality flaws, you can always find something. But I would argue that Democrats, not all Democrats certainly, but many Democratic elites have placed a premium on identity and really leaned into identity as I would argue in some cases maybe to mask policies that are not necessarily going to be popular, or vast expansions of the federal government that will make people nervous, even if they do support, abstractly the goal of having a more robust social safety net or, more health care coverage or something. The details of how Democrats propose to do that makes people very wary, and so they lean in some cases on identity arguments. And with Tim Walz, I'm not saying it's like a fake idea. Obviously, I don't know the man. I'm not saying the interests he purports to have in sports and whatever are false. I don't think he was as naturally, this just sounds like cool or so interested in those things that it was going to be a cover for whatever his political agenda is. In the same way, like I know what they're trying to do. Again, it's the Joe Rogan of the left idea. They're trying to have someone who is just cool and well liked by these voters that they're losing, young, not young white guys, just men in general, who then has policies they like.
Well,
and they had that idea, like Tim Walz was that maybe on paper to them, and I think they didn't look at it more closely than that.
Yeah, but I think where I perhaps disagree with you a bit is the idea that, the policies are the problem. There has been a persistent push from conservative media to not merely disparage democratic policies of various kinds, but to cast them as in some way un-American or out of step with real America. And real America, as it is characterized in conservative media, is almost always white, conservative, and often small town or rural. And I think Waltz was put forth as somewhat of an antidote to that. Now, in addition, I just don't obviously agree with that argument. The Bronx is as much part of real America as, rural Ohio. So I don't agree with the characterization, but I do think that there is a vulnerability there that Democrats had to try to repair or ease to the best extent possible.
Up next on Rising, Trump spilled the tea on his conversation with Zelensky, shared his thoughts on whether Stephen A. Smith should run for president. That was all a fascinating NewsNation town hall event that we will recap for you coming up next. NewsNation's Chris Cuomo held a town hall that included Stephen A. Smith, Bill O'Reilly, and President Donald Trump.
Trump phoned in and discussed his first 100 days. The president revealed what he and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had discussed in Rome.
Yeah.
What were you and Zelensky talking about when you were nose to nose in the Vatican?
I was telling him that it's a very good thing if we can produce a deal that you sign it, because Russia is much bigger and much stronger. Russia is just chugging forward. It's a big, strong country. By the way, not nearly as strong as the United States, because I rebuilt our military in my first term.
Trump also spoke on tariffs and trade deals. O'Reilly asked Trump about whether his tariff policy would help Democrats in the midterms.
Remember, if it doesn't stabilize this time next year, Democrats may win the midterms. So there is risk here, big risk.
That's true. It is true. And I just think that I'll be able to convince people how good this is. We were ripped off by China, but we were ripped off by everybody, but really by China. They were the king of ripping off the United States. Now they're not doing any business here because I don't want them to do business. So I set a high tariff. I don't want them to do business. Now, will we make a deal? There's a very good chance we're going to make a deal, but we're going to make it on our terms.
Okay.
Trump told Cuomo that his administration was not doing anything to hurt entitlements and would not hurt Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. An audience member asked the president what has been his biggest mistake in the first 100 days. Trump said that was the toughest question since he doesn't believe he has made any mistake.
Lastly, Trump addressed the possibility of Stephen A. Smith, who was one of those presenters, running for president.
Do you have any advice for Stephen A. If he launches the run?
No, Stephen A. He's a good guy. He's a smart guy. I love watching him. He's got great entertainment skills, which is very important. People watch him. You know, a lot of these Democrats I watch, I say they have no chance. I've been pretty good at picking people and picking candidates, and I will tell you, I'd love to see him run.
All right, there you go.
He could run against Trump for that
third
term that we keep
The
hearing.
unconstitutional third term that he keeps toying with.
I thought it was a very good event. Cuomo and O'Reilly are pros at this, and Stephen A. Smith did a great job too. You know, the top line for me is Trump is sticking by the trade policy that he has outlined. Thinks that that was a very reasonable question from O'Reilly. That, you know, what if Democrats capitalize on the fact that this has harmed the economy in the short term, and Trump is convinced of his ability to persuade voters that it is in their long-term best interests to adopt this policy, so here we are.
I did think that his comments on that topic were interesting because he talks about the tariff question as being, the exact quote was, a little complicated, and he has to explain it. And I think even critics of Trump on the right or on the libertarian wing on the tariff policy would argue that, in fact, it is complicated and he doesn't understand it terribly well, which is why he has pitched himself into the difficulty that he has done. We see his poll numbers eroding pretty badly. You were talking yesterday, I think, about the new DDHQ numbers. And even yesterday at a separate event, Trump was talking about trade imbalances as if those are subsidies.
Yeah, I was actually
going to
build up bring up this exact issue. He sometimes describes the trade deficit in ways that all this value is leaving our country because we're trading, and so the things we're buying, whoever we're buying them from is then receiving our money, and then it's just a one-way transfer of our money to them. But if you think about, our money has no value if you cannot use it to barter for things. I could have a stockpile of gold, but if no one is willing to give me anything in exchange for the gold is worthless. So I have a trade imbalance with Panera Bread Company because they give me bread and I give them money. So after that exchange, I have less money, but I have traded my money for something I I need and want more than just the literal pieces of paper or whatever it is.
Delicious sandwiches in the
Right.
case of Panera Bread.
So that's how it works. So you'd have to, and he sometimes does not seem to manifest an understanding of that, and that concerns me because that's a pretty fundamental.
Right.
If you think that's bad, then you would think all trade is bad.
Right.
But then
exactly.
that wouldn't even make sense because that would be internal to the country. Unless you're saying I should bake all my own bread, assemble all my own furniture,
Right.
eat my bread with utensils I myself have carved from it doesn't.
From
That's
a tree trunk. Yeah.
And frankly, the only other category of people I can find or I recall who think that is truly the way we should live are like the most far left sociologists, sort of Marxist, like being alienated from your own labor is a bad thing, and assembly line production is bad, and we should all be producing our own thing. Like that's Karl Marx and then some. So I don't know why it should not be the policy of the Republican president. And again, to emphasize this, I do not like hearing Marxist talking points coming out of the White House. Yesterday at the cabinet meeting that they had, he talked about the limiting of options. You know, we're going to have fewer Chinese goods. So do you really need $30? You're only going to have 2.
Yeah.
I'm like, but. Okay, now that's like a Bernie Sanders thing that I have long criticized, where it's like, why do you need so many choices of things? I thought we were going to get rid of the World Economic Forum's whole, like, you will own nothing and like it. No, this is like limiting choices, giving people less of stuff is bad and is a political loser.
Right, and I mean, that thing about the dolls was getting very close to almost like a state control of the economy, right? Or the idea that you're going to ration things or you don't need that. So,
it was said that you were supposed to destroy the Sith, not join them.
Exactly.
To quote a movie that our viewers are, I'm sure, happy to see in theaters this week.
So it doesn't sound like you will be growing your own vegetables or keeping your own chickens over in Soave Towers?
No, and again, I would support your freedom to be able to do that. There are regulations preventing you from having your own chickens in all sorts of cities that I think are bad. My brother in Grand Rapids, Michigan, he has a chicken coop. He has some chickens that produces eggs. If you enjoy doing it, that's fine.
Sure.
My overall philosophy is people can enjoy making different choices for themselves. Because everyone is different, and that's fine.
Right.
And government policy, to the extent it is necessary, should facilitate you living your life to its own fulfillment. I don't know how to run Niall's life. I would be very bad at it. Niall should run Niall's life. Robby should run Robby's life, and so on and so forth. So and I've often criticized, again, I associate this with the very furthest left governance saying, we're deciding what's best for you. Here is a limited range of choices we think should be okay. So I don't like to see Trump adopt that framing.
We could have a whole other discussion about the libertarian view of whether we really get to control our own lives entirely or whether we are the product of forces of history.
You're saying we're being puppet mastered by sinister
no,
global forces? Is that what you're saying, Niall?
I'm not saying that we do not want to go down that road. But I do not think, as libertarians tend to, that individuals live in isolation from the larger social or historical forces that shape them.
Well, President Trump says he can, but won't bring back a man that the government has acknowledged was mistakenly deported to El Salvador. Is he defying the Supreme Court? We will argue about it. Stay tuned.
Federal Judge Paula Zinnes is once again directing the Trump administration to provide her with more information on their efforts to return Kilmar Abrego Garcia. That's the man, of course, wrongly deported to a Salvadorian mega prison in March.
On Wednesday, Judge Zinnes set deadlines this month for administration officials to provide sworn testimony on the administration's efforts to facilitate Abrego Garcia's return. Trump seemed to throw a wrench in the government's case. During his 100-day interview with ABC News this week, the president said he had the power to bring Abrego Garcia back, but seemed to say that he would not do so. Let's listen.
You could get him back. There's a phone on this desk.
I could.
You could pick it up, and with all the power of the presidency, you could call up the president of El Salvador and say, send him back right now.
And if he were the gentleman that you say he is, I would do that.
But the court has ordered you to facilitate that.
I'm not the one making this decision. We have lawyers that don't want to do this.
But the buck stops in this office.
No.
This all comes as new video shows Venezuelan detainees at the Blue Bonnet Detention Facility in Anson, Texas, spelling out SOS, as you can see there on your screen. The men being held there narrowly avoided deportation to that Salvadorian mega prison, but they were turned around at or close to the airport after a Supreme Court ruling ordering that those detainees be given reasonable time to contest their pending removals.
Meanwhile, an investigation by the New York Times is raising new questions about whether the Trump administration did vet the people they were sending to the foreign prison. In the agreement between U.S. and El Salvador, Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele agreed to only house what he called convicted criminals. Many of those labeled gang members by the Trump administration had actually never been tried in court. The report says Bukele is demanding more information about the individuals who were previously deported to his prison, and the administration is scrambling to respond.
A sore point for the Trump administration, I think. To my mind, it's fairly clear that their belief that this particular case would redound to their political benefit isn't really working. There was a very interesting Fox News poll that split out the topic of border security, on which Trump still scores quite highly, from that of deportations, where it was a much more even split. The fundamental problem with Abrego Garcia, you and I have talked about it before, is his deportation was fundamentally lawless because there's an immigration court order saying you cannot deport this guy to El Salvador, he'll be in danger. That order was never invalidated, it still stands, and they did it anyway. That's the problem. Now, whether he's a fantastic guy or not, whether he's a member of MS-13 or not, is beside the point. The point is that there was that order and the Trump administration disregarded it.
Look, it is beside the point in terms of the legal argument. That is true, and I have said repeatedly that I think, per the judge's order, the Trump administration should make its best effort to facilitate his return to the country so that he can be deported elsewhere. I think it is very reasonable to question whether they are making a good faith effort to do just that. Trump seemed to suggest. Now, Trump is there basically. He said, interestingly enough, I would do it, but I think he is a bad guy. I think given the visits to him by Democratic figures and the way the media has reported on his, initially characterized him as like this loving Maryland father, conservatives have sought to make relevant elements of his backstory that, again, don't matter for the legal case, but maybe complicate this from a political matter. That there was a New York Post report this week on his wife's ex contesting in court that he was certainly that she was dating a member of a gang. Yeah. There is a tremendous amount of evidence to suggest that he was in fact in a gang.
Well, hold on. Now, on that New York Post story, I thought that was very thin. I completely acknowledge that two separate immigration court judges back in the day, yes, 2018 or 19, found he was a member of a gang. The thing that the New York Post published was the wife's ex saying she was dating an unnamed gang member. But I mean, if we're going to take every claim made in a custody case between former partners as gospel, we'd be in a whole lot of trouble.
I wouldn't hang it on just that, but that in addition to the court findings.
Yeah, but I mean,
I'm saying
but none of them change the legality of it.
No, I know, but well, right, but the conservative response to I'm telling you what the right is saying about it. They're saying this is a gang member. Mm-hmm. It has been pretty well demonstrated in court. The court has bought that argument for good reason. This is a gang member. This is a man from El Salvador. He is now back in El Salvador, and we're not going to go out on a limb to have him returned. That is the conservative position.
But that
he
position...
he is in the country that he is a citizen of.
But that position involves defiance of American courts. That's the problem. That it involves the administration saying, doesn't really matter what the court says, we'll decide. That's the danger in this case. That is why Democrats are saying, look, this is about the rule of law. That's the central point, much as the related, though separate, case about the deportation flights is part of that debate. Judge Boasberg in the deportation flights ordering flights to be turned around, and the administration saying, tough, we're just going to go ahead with them. That's where the difficulty arises. Now, just briefly on the gang member point, We didn't play it there, and I'm not sure if you discussed it yesterday, but in that ABC interview, shout out to Terry Moran. We often hit establishment media figures here, but he was very good when Trump appeared to believe that a photo of Abrego Garcia's hands that has definitely been photoshopped had not.
Right. The photo is to claim that the tattoos, the symbols are the interpretation is MS-13, not that it actually says MS-13 on his fingers.
Right.
Trump seemed unaware of that, and I think I criticized him on Twitter for it yesterday. Yes, that is not, the piece of evidence is not that he actually literally has the letters and numbers MS-13 on his fingers. I think there's plenty of other evidence, and that's, again, not just my opinion, was the court's opinion. Look, this is kind of a tricky situation. Like, you talk about the rule of law. I agree the Trump administration should do what the judge says, although facilitate his return is open a little bit to interpretation, or at least they're making the argument now that what do we have to reorganize the entire foreign policy of the country to return a man who's not a citizen of this country, who is a citizen of El Salvador. I mean, what if the rule of law of El Salvador? What if their position is, this is our guy, and you're trying to kidnap him back to a foreign country to which he has no identity?
But Robby, that's why Trump's remarks that we did play there are so damaging to his own case. He kind of blew up that argument when Terry Moran said to him, there's a phone right there on the desk, you could call him. And Trump said, yeah, I could. So Trump is himself admitting that he could bring the guy back if he wished to do so. And obviously he is deciding that he will not do so then. And there's where he... The
good follow-up question there would have been, well, if your objection to bringing him back is just that he's not a good guy, what about, we can go to some of those other cases, the hairdresser case, right, where there's no evidence whatsoever that he's in, it's clearly a mistake. So I would like to put that question to Trump then. If his position is we're not going to bring back, presumed gangbangers, well, there are other individuals we're concerned about. Next up, the Wisconsin Supreme Court weighs in on the FBI's arrest of Judge Hannah Dugan. We'll discuss that. Stay with us.
The case against Judge Hannah Dugan is heating up. Now, the Wisconsin judge has been suspended by that state's Supreme Court. She's been accused of helping a man evade immigration authorities.
The suspension comes days after the FBI took Dugan into custody. She faces charges of concealing an individual to prevent his discovery and arrest. She's also being accused of obstructing or impeding a proceeding.
The High Court says it was not responding to a request from anyone, writing, quote, in order to uphold the public's confidence in the courts of the state during the pendency of the criminal proceedings against Judge Dugan, we conclude in our own motion that it is in the public interest that she be temporarily relieved of her official duties.
It's important to note that liberal justices do control the Badger State Supreme Court 4-3. The Heritage Foundation took to X to talk about Dugan, writing, Judge Hannah Dugan violated numerous laws in order to help an illegal alien evade capture by ICE agents. Just like anyone else who violates federal immigration law or otherwise attempts to obstruct justice, she should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
Others were quick to defend Dugan. Political commentator from the left, Brian Krasenstein, says, maybe if our government stopped shipping innocent immigrants off to foreign torture prisons, shredding the 5th and 14th Amendments, Americans wouldn't have to risk everything to protect them. Robby?
I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this one, Niall. Look, I think this judge is certainly entitled to due process, presumption of innocence, just like everyone else. Government has to make its case that she basically helped this illegal immigrant elude capture by ICE by basically spiriting him out a back door of the courtroom. It is very common for ICE agents to apprehend illegal immigrants at court proceedings, which for an argument that actually makes perfect sense because to get into a court, you've gone through a metal detector and a screening. Interactions with police can always go south. It's safer for the police and thus safer for the person being apprehended if there's not going to be a scuffle, if nobody's going to pull a knife or a gun. So if you do that already past a secure location, it's less likely for there to be violence. That's good for everybody. That is what we want. He was at this court proceeding. He was accused of domestic violence. So they were there to apprehend him, and they contend that she helped him get out a side door. Now, she could have an explanation for why that happened. She should be able to present it, and it's on the government to prove that no, she really was trying to help him evade capture by ICE. But I know we're living in this era of like, oh, the Trump's war on judges and everything. they've made a compelling case, and I don't know that this is just automatically can be chalked up to overreach by the Trump administration, but what are your thoughts?
I may shock you by agreeing with you.
Oh, nice.
No, I do actually think this is the case. We were discussing in a previous segment of today's show the importance of the rule of law, which I was foregrounding in the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. In this case, the judge, as you say, is accused of spiriting this man, and I think his lawyer, out the jury door. And basically, there had been immigration agents just outside, in the hallway outside the court. She sent the agents allegedly off to talk to the chief judge. She got these guys out a side door, a back door, jury door. And what ultimately ended up happening was, according to the charging documents, a chase on foot for about a block outside the courthouse.
Right. Important note, they did get him.
They did get him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was done. Now, the argument is that not only was the judge wrong to do what she did, but she had, in fact, increased the danger to the public because of the very points that you raised. A courthouse is typically a safer area than the street outside. I get the argument that is made in two ways from the Liberal side. One is judges sometimes don't love immigration authorities showing up because they wonder, does that then deter people from coming for criminal or other cases that are not related to their immigration status? You can make that argument, but it's not a terribly strong argument, in my opinion. Then the other thing is the Krasenstein argument, I think, which is, they're going around arresting judges now. Well, they've arrested this person because they are charging her with two criminal offences, in fact, and she's going to be arraigned in a couple of weeks' time. I obviously do not support the widespread arresting of judges, but I also don't think judges are themselves immune to the laws.
But and she's not being arrested because of some ruling.
Right,
it was an action she took.
Now, I would stress that she insists she didn't break the law, and every time someone's criminal case comes up here, we say that people are entitled to their day in court and to plead not guilty, and she apparently is going to do that. Let's hear what her side of the story is. But on the fundamentals, was there some grievous wrong done here? I don't think so, really, no.
I was looking for a defense of the judge's actions, and actually my colleagues at Reason Magazine, Damon Root, who writes about judicial issues for us, he says that, he does think this, they have a case, the criminal obstruction, it's definitely a case. He's just kind of looking for, what argument could you muster? And that it would basically be hinging on that the courtroom is
sacrosanct.
The judge. Not even that is the judge's jurisdiction. And the judge gets to determine what goes on in the courtroom. And also that federal officials cannot compel local officials, there have been cases about this, into being immigration officials or being officials in whatever variety of crimes. Just like if ATF showed up and wanted, the judge's help apprehending some person who's an illegal gun, the judge was like, I don't have to do that. This is my courtroom. When you're outside the courtroom, you can arrest him, but I don't have to walk the suspect past you in a way that's the argument based on some case law I'm understanding that they might make.
So I wonder, to that point, is that why then the immigration agents did not actually enter the courtroom? They were outside in a hallway, as I understand, hoping to effectuate an arrest.
Which I understand that is normal procedure, I think.
I take my hat off to your Reason colleague trying to make the argument. Right. The argument that it is the judge's jurisdiction seems fairly thin to me, because yes, a judge, of course, has the capacity to impose order in a courtroom, but you couldn't just, as a judge, start, building a bomb in the corner on the basis that you have jurisdiction over the room, right?
The case that my colleague cites is Prince versus the United States. I'll read from what he wrote. In that case, the Supreme Court overruled a provision of the 93 Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act that required local police to help the feds enforce federal gun control laws. This was a decision by Antonin Scalia. The federal government may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems nor command the states' officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. The argument would be that the judge is under no obligation to do anything to assist the ICE agents from arresting the person. Now, I don't know that argument's going to work
Yeah.
because that was gun control issues. This is immigration issues, and also they might say that they couldn't compel the judge to hold the guy while he's trying to get away, but that she did more than that.
Exactly.
She actually helped them elude capture.
Right. So the argument isn't that she was purely passive. The argument is
she could have stood there motionless as he ran past her, but to actually say, "Oh, there's the door. Use the one on the left."
There you go. Out this way. So that's a problem.
All right. Yeah, I love it when we often reach common ground. That can be educational, I think, for viewers as well.
Sure. Up next, what is the brain drain? We'll tell you. That's coming up next. Brain drain is real and seems to be happening in America. The phrase is, of course, slang for the emigration of skilled workers, academics, and professionals from one country to another. In the past, the US saw many foreign scholars flock here because of war and political instability elsewhere. Now that trend is reversing. In a recently penned op-ed for The Hill, Northwestern University Associate Professor Erica Hartmann highlights how America has been a leader in science and innovation, but that leadership, she says, is threatened. President Trump's rapid-fire dismantling of academic, scientific, and research institutions is, quote, akin to opening a fire hose of policies detrimental to American science. Joining us now to discuss how Trump's policies may drive away such talent is Erica Hartmann. She teaches civil and environmental engineering at Northwestern. Welcome, Erica.
Thanks for having me.
So this is clearly, to your mind, a real threat. You think, I gather, that the Trump administration is creating an essentially sort of inhospitable atmosphere, particularly for the sciences. So just summarize why you think that is.
It's about certainly funding. So there have been a lot of decisions that have sort of gone back and forth in terms of abruptly stopping funding for research, reducing funding for research in forthcoming budgets, and then, of course, freezing funding for specific universities for specific reasons. So between that and decisions about student visas and the abrupt cancellation of student visas, a lot of that has been really destabilizing to the entire research industry, and especially academic research.
What countries do you think might, I guess, be beneficiaries then if it's really the case that academics don't want to or feel discouraged from doing their research or residing in the U.S.? You know, there are vast protections for freedom of speech and academic freedom and such things in the U.S. that certainly exist to varying degrees in some of other friendly Western countries, but do not exist in places like Russia and China and so forth. So where are the exiles going to flee to, do you think?
I think that's a really key point, is that a lot of people come to the US specifically because they're seeking those kinds of freedoms and the kind of atmosphere that is really nurturing of open inquiry and of unrestricted research. And the types of decisions that are being made in the US essentially make it less favorable for that, both in terms, again, of what's being funded, how things are being funded, how contracts are being honored, and that kind of thing. So the countries that are really, I think, poised to benefit, there are a lot of places in Europe that are rolling out programs specifically to entice US researchers to come over. So I think there are a few countries that have already issued statements and created programs, and there are a lot I've heard that are sort of rolling them out.
This is obviously also a personal story for you, at least to some extent, because you note in the piece that your grandfather was a Polish Jew who fled the Nazis and then came to the United States and taught for many decades, I think, at American University, if I'm remembering correctly.
That's correct, yes.
So, I mean, it must be somewhat troublesome. Academics and researchers are being targeted or made to feel marginalized to the degree to which they may leave the country.
It's really destabilizing for me personally, because, yeah, I have always thought of the US as A, the leader in scientific research, and B, the type of place where we welcome the best and the brightest. Like that's sort of been the way it's been the whole time I've been alive. And to see that change so dramatically sort of underneath my feet is really destabilizing for me. And I think for a lot of people, a lot of students are quite frankly afraid and concerned. And I think a lot of people are really uncertain about the future, which means that we're jeopardizing not just the people who might, for example, take up offers to go to Europe now, but generations of researchers and those generations of trainees who will then become the workers in our, highly skilled technology companies and biotechnology and all of the things that traditionally we associate with American leadership in terms of innovation and economic development.
How would you respond to this line of inquiry from someone on the right who would say, these institutions of higher learning are themselves incredibly wealthy in many cases. Endowments of Harvard is billions and billions and billions of dollars. This is public taxpayer money that comes with strings attached and comes with democratic considerations. And while I'm sure some of this research is very popular, other aspects of it are not as desirable in a country where half the people who live here voted for Trump, don't want to spend taxpayer dollars on this sort of thing. What do you say to them to say no? Is there an entitlement to this money? Is how they would put it probably.
I think it's such a tricky question, and so I want to make clear a couple of things. So one thing is that the way research funding is actually awarded is it's a highly competitive process, and the government sort of issues priorities in terms of what research it wants to see funded, and then researchers at universities come up with proposals to how they will address those priorities and how they will advance research in those areas. So this is a highly competitive process. People spend months or years preparing those proposals and competing for that funding. Once the funding is awarded, it's typically in sort of trenches for a few years, maybe 3 to 5. And one of the things that's happened is that those contracts that have been awarded, which were a response to the previously established federal priorities for research areas, are being frozen or canceled. And so that's actually research that the government has previously identified as being important for the U.S. society priority areas, that's actually being canceled. And so the things that are being affected aren't just things that are maybe niche or unpopular. It's actually just blanket across the board, all NSF funding, all NIH funding, all funding to a specific university. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the way, again, that this funding works is that it doesn't necessarily just go to the institution, it goes to a specific group. So for example, when I get a research grant, it comes to my group and I have to spend that money only on that project and I support only my students on it. And so when that money gets taken away, it's actually impacting the livelihood of my students who I need that funding to pay their salaries and to pay for their healthcare and things like that. So it's the type of thing where, yes, I understand that popular priorities may shift. And I think in the past, people have been really responsive to that when there are new initiatives and new areas of research that we as a collective, as a democratic society, decide are important. I think the research enterprise in the United States has been really responsive to that. But I think it's really destabilizing to midstream cut that funding, and really especially destabilizing to the individuals who are staking their livelihood and their career development on it.
Erica Hartmann of Northwestern, thanks for joining us on Rising.
Thank you so much.
Up next, Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson are trading shots over U.S. involvement in foreign wars. More Rising right after this. There's a beef brewing between two prominent figures on the right, Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro.
The two have traded jabs in the past, but it seems like things have escalated a bit. Shapiro traveled to Ukraine in April to interview Volodymyr Zelensky.
Once it was over, Shapiro gave an analysis and took a shot at Carlson and Vice President Vance while discussing Russian philosopher Alexander Dugan. Let's listen.
Among the people that he name-checks in his new book are Tucker Carlson and J.D. Vance, his ideological allies. And Tucker is Dugan's ally here. I mean, there's just no question about this. Tucker literally had on Dugan last year on his show and praised him, and then refused to ask him a single question about Russia or Russian ambitions because that might burst the viewer's bubble.
I'm merely saying we should talk openly and not leave it to the crazy people. And you can't,
Do you think,
because all of a sudden you've got Ben Shapiro being like, oh, you're sucking up to Putin. You're anti-Semitic. It's like, son, sit this one out. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're a child, actually. And you're reading talking points that discredit you. I think Ben is smart. He probably has interesting things to say. But when you are unwilling to criticize a foreign government at all, it tells the rest of us what you're saying isn't real. Like,
Carlson did say that he doesn't think Shapiro is evil or a bad person. He said he just wishes there could be a more honest conversation about American involvement in foreign wars.
And what's so wrong with that? I agree with Tucker Carlson.
But I think Shapiro argues that Carlson has ducked debates with him. Now, I hesitate to get into this because you are a lot better versed on debates and personal enmities on the online right than I am. But Shapiro, I'm pretty sure, has offered to debate Carlson a number of times and believes that that hasn't happened.
I'm not sure which is the case. They did. They participated in a conversation years and years and years ago that was very interesting because it was heralding the breakup that was about to occur on the right, or some of the ideological arguments that were going to happen, because they were discussing basically loss of jobs due to jobs moving overseas. And Shapiro, who's more of a free market guy than Tucker Carlson, said something like, what are we going to do? We're going to have some policy to protect like all the trucking jobs in America? And Tucker was like, yeah, I would absolutely support that, which is now that kind of economic thinking is certainly more in vogue than it was before. On economic issues, I am much more in a Ben Shapiro camp. On foreign policy, I am much more in a Tucker Carlson camp. So I find their disputes interesting because I like and agree with some things Tucker says and like and agree with some things Ben Shapiro says. I think, in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, I, like Tucker and many others on the dissident right or the non-interventionist right, think we should have to live in reality and have to have an end to this war, even if it's going to result in Russia getting a lot more than we want to be the case. Like Ben Shapiro, I don't think that we should shy from calling out Russia as a autocratic country run by a bad man and an enemy of us. That's the line Trump takes. We played earlier in the show a clip of him talking about the need for, Zelensky to negotiate with Russia, but Russia is a worse and weak country and the U.S. is so much greater, rah, rah, rah. So that's the Trump stance, which I agree with. But I think they should have a debate, and it's good to have these debates on the right, and that's all fine and good.
It is good to have these debates on the right or anywhere else. On the foreign policy question, I'm divided even within that, because I'm more on the Shapiro line in relation to Russia and Ukraine. And I think he makes a strong argument, and one that I think is a very important argument, about Putin and people like the guy we mentioned, Alexander Dugan, who don't really believe that Ukraine is an independent nation to start off with. And I think that sometimes gets overlooked both on a certain element of the right and on the extreme left, where we were talking about horseshoe politics earlier on. Often it is the endless foregrounding of, well, it's about NATO expansionism, it's about Putin's fears. It's not only about that. I would argue it's not even primarily about that. It's about Putin's refusal to recognize Ukraine as an independent nation and his belief that it should be forcibly incorporated back into a kind of Russian empire. Now, on the other element of foreign policy that divides those two guys, Shapiro is extremely pro-Israel. believes that the West Bank should just be fully recognized as Israeli territory, has argued for decades that Palestinians should be kind of shipped off Palestinian land. I find those views completely abhorrent. I come down completely on the opposite side of that point. But it is good to have debates.
And Tucker, on the other hand, has made no secret of his vast disagreement with a myopically pro-Israel Hamas. We're not for terrorists, but the brutal destruction occurring there is going beyond anything that can be justified or anything that is going to be in the U.S.'s interest, which is the main issue. How does this serve U.S. policy? Going back just for a second to the Russia-Ukraine thing. So yes, Ukraine should remain. I want Ukraine to remain an independent country, but that is my reason for wanting to negotiate. I think if we pursue the current line, Russia will eventually conquer the entire country. And it is my desire to preserve something of Ukraine that I support the Trump administration policy of really pushing them to negotiate.
But-
or else they're going to conquer the country.
but-
to your broader point,
yeah.
well, you can respond to that if you want.
Well, I just don't think. I think that the costs for Russia become unsustainable in terms of loss of life, suffering, potentially decline of oil prices could further hamper the Russian economy, etc.
I just don't think
We
that's
just
gonna happen.
disagree.
But I agree with you on. Some people on the left and maybe the right as well do this, and well, everybody does this selectively, and it always annoys me. Where everything that you think that you can the bad thing, and then say, well, we're only reacting to something they did, but you can always play that game because everything that has happened in a foreign policy context is a response to something else, and you can always cut it off there and say, well, that's the initiator. But there's always something that came before that. Like, was the NATO expansion a good idea? No. Did that provoke Russia in some way? Yes. But the NATO expansion was because of the reality of the fallout from the Cold War,
Right.
where we had a very hostile, evil, communist country
Expansionist country as well,
doing
yeah.
a bad thing. But again, you don't have to cut it off there. They were responding to a czarist system of oppression, right? You can always go back another decade.
And a great powers war in the
Right.
First World
You can
War
always
and all
say, well,
that.
they did it for this reason,
Right.
and they did it for this reason, and they did it for this reason. And what people who want to maximize U.S. responsibility and minimize responsibility will always say, well, we are the prime mover. So none of our actions are inspired or caused by anything else. So we are always the instigator of bad things that happen, whereas the other guy, well, they're just doing for X, Y, Z.
In reaction to U.S. actions.
And that is a dumb argument
Yeah,
when you think about it.
Yeah.
We, like them, are reacting to things, and I always want to be forward-thinking and say, well, you know, Israel-Palestine is the prime example of this. Israel did a lot of bad things to Palestine. Palestine does a lot of bad. Hamas does a lot of bad things to Israel. You can justify this forever. You can always go back and say, well, they did it for this reason. Well, they did it for this reason. Well, they did it for this reason. There's been conflict in this region for 2,000 years and beyond. So if you're always going to be backward looking and saying, well, this is the reason this is justified, you'll just have war forever. And the way you bring down conflict in modern times is to say, you know what? We're just going to say we're not going to have an argument anymore about who's justified for whatever reason. Sure. We're just going to say we want peace, and these are going to be the terms of that peace.
Yeah, I agree with that point, and I think we may disagree in terms of the Russia-Ukraine question, but I agree with that argument, and even some people on the left, I do disagree when they tend sometimes to propose foreign policies that I think they see as aimed at expiating the sins of the past.
Yeah.
Like, you got to work with what the situation is now. I think the situation in Gaza is appalling. I wouldn't support Israel in doing it. I think the situation in Ukraine is appalling in a different way, and I'd back up the Ukrainians. People can have legitimate differences about that, but you've got to work with what the facts are right now.
Up next, hostile powers buying influence in U.S. elite schools. We will talk to a reporter from the Free Press. Stay with us. Foreign powers, even U.S. adversaries, are buying influence in American universities by the billions. Qatar, China, and other countries donated as much money to U.S. elite universities in the last 4 years as they did in the previous 40. This is according to a new report shared exclusively with the Free Press. Top donors, Qatar and China, have poured in $29 billion to colleges, including Harvard, Cornell, Yale, and others since 2020.
This practice has been increasingly scrutinized, and that scrutiny is getting tougher. In April, President Trump ordered these institutions to fully disclose how much they're raking in from international sources.
Joining us now to elaborate is Free Press reporter Frannie Block. Welcome to Rising.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we really appreciate you discussing this topic with us. When we say Qatar, China, and others are putting money into elite universities, what do we actually mean by that? What is the mechanism of that? Are they just like writing checks to the president of Harvard saying, here's some money? What are they doing?
So basically, all of this data that I wrote about in the Free Press, this is based off of public disclosure requirements. So the government has technically been tracking any donation from either a foreign government or a foreign donor to a U.S. university since like the 1980s. However, this data is not super comprehensive. And we've seen in the past couple of years many different examples of universities kind of trying to get around having to disclose this data. I know during Trump's first term, for example, they found over $6 billion in unreported funds that were coming from foreign sources. So this is kind of an imperfect data set, but it's all based off of public disclosures.
And Frannie, in the last 4 years, we mentioned some of the countries that are the major donors, but topping the list is actually Germany. Is that correct?
It is actually in the last 4 years, and a large chunk of that German funding, I was kind of perplexed by this when I first saw it too. A large chunk of that has to do actually with COVID-19 vaccines. So there was actually a settlement that Germany, a German biotech pharmaceutical company, had to pay the University of Pennsylvania in the multi-millions just a few years back because they were accused of improperly giving credit to the University of Pennsylvania's vaccine technology in manufacturing COVID vaccines. So I think that explains some of the German funding, but it was a peculiar data point that I did find very interesting in this data.
That is very interesting. So we would not take that one to be necessarily nefarious. Not that any of these are, I guess, necessarily nefarious, but we are obviously at a moment in our political identity as a country where we are concerned about rising tensions with China. We're trying to work out economic policies with China, trade policies with China. Is there some perception that China is trying to make the elite academic community, the next leaders of the free world are often graduates of elite institutions, more friendly to China, and then that's the kind of political valence of the spending?
Obviously, given what we've seen happen on college campuses over the past 2 years, it's understandable that people are concerned that foreign countries are essentially buying influence on our campus. However, I want to stick just to kind of what this data is telling us, which is actually, unfortunately, not a ton. And I do think that's part of kind of this new movement now for greater accountability and where this foreign funding is, one, coming from, but also where it's going on college campuses. Because unfortunately, what we can't do with this data is track what departments is it funding, what programming is this funding on college campuses. Now, when it comes to Qatar, we actually do know that a lot of that money is going towards Education City in Doha, which is Qatar's capital. So Qatar is actually subsidizing many different campuses of top universities, Northwestern's journalism school, Georgetown's foreign policy school, so that they can have campuses in Doha. A lot of Qatari money going into U.S. universities goes towards that. But other than that, we don't really understand where this money is going. And I think, again, that's a really big, important question. And it does raise concerns about how easy it could be for a foreign power to buy influence on an American university campus, because it's simply something we're not really tracking.
I wonder, Frannie, if there's an interesting sort of dichotomy or tension here, because on one hand, we mentioned in the introduction that the Trump administration is tightening requirements as far as disclosure for this kind of funding is concerned. And then on the other hand, we have had the president threaten to freeze funding for various American institutions himself. And I note that in your list from the data of some of the biggest beneficiaries of foreign funding, there are at least 4 colleges that have in some way been in the president's crosshairs over alleged anti-Semitism or anything else. For our viewers' information, I'm talking about Harvard, Cornell, UPenn, and Johns Hopkins. Is there any danger that funding freezes, if it comes to that, actually opens the door wider for this kind of foreign funding?
Absolutely. And it's actually the same question that I asked researchers at the Network Contagion Research Institute who helped give this data to the Free Press. I asked them that directly, and I do think that there are concerns if there are funding freezes, so money from the federal government that normally would go to a school like Harvard that's no longer going to a school like Harvard. Obviously, universities are going to be incentivized to look elsewhere to fill that gap. Now, whether or not they go seek out foreign funds, we don't know what they're going to do, but I do think that foreign countries, particularly authoritarian regimes seeking to gain influence in American university life, they're going to see a huge opportunity here. But I'll also add that with Trump's new disclosure requirements, he actually hasn't added any new requirements. He's essentially kind of increased the federal government's enforcement mechanism for ensuring that universities are complying. But there also are other ways for foreign governments to also get around that as well. They can send money through nonprofits in the United States and then send that to universities. And that's not technically something that needs to be disclosed under this Section 117 funding. So I do think that we are going to see an increase in foreign funding continue. Now, whether or not the federal government is going to have actually the capability to crack down on that, or what they're going to do to crack down on that, I don't know. So we'll see what happens.
Frannie, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Next up on Rising, a monumental West Wing shakeup. What's next for National Security Advisor Mike Waltz? Some breaking news. Mike Waltz is out as National Security Advisor. President Trump is planning to oust Waltz following the Signalgate scandal.
Several names have already been floated to take over Waltz's position. The replacement has been in the works for weeks, but has recently gained traction in recent days. Deputy Alex Wong, that's Deputy 2, Mr. Waltz, is also slated to leave his post following the Signal chat fallout.
This, I think, is a good idea, is straightforwardly the right thing to do. Mike Waltz is the figure who is responsible for having inadvertently, he says, added Jeffrey Goldberg to the Signal chat where plans to bomb the Houthis was discussed. It is notable because there was actually a difference of opinion between Vice President J.D. Vance and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth about the wisdom of doing this at the time they did it. It became a big national story because Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. Mike Waltz is the one who caused that. He says it was a mistake. Me and some other people on the right who are anti-interventionist, who like the Libertarian Populist Foreign Policy Alliance, myself, Sagar and Jetty, Amber Duke, who hosts the show often with you on Fridays, have all been not pleased that it seemed Mike Waltz was hanging on, as he is also a figure from the Cheney era, more inclined, I think, toward a pro-intervention foreign policy. A lot of people who are more in my way of thinking have exited the Pentagon in recent weeks, seemingly taking the blame for a series of leaks, maybe this as well. So that was all sort of frustrating to someone of my ideology when the person who is actually responsible was not being held accountable. Now, according to reporting, it's all over social media, he is being held accountable. It sounds like he really did fight for his job and try to hang on, but Trump has apparently...
For his job as recently as yesterday, when in that cabinet meeting, he was paying extremely flamboyant or extravagant tribute to Trump. 3 quick points, Robby, because this is breaking minutes ago. It actually hurt the administration. It wasn't so much an ideological issue as an issue of, like, when you're discussing bombing a foreign country, you probably shouldn't, by mistake, put a journalist on the chat, even though it's very good for journalism, of course. Then there's the separate issue, which you already mentioned, about the ideological idea. Mike Waltz much more associated with that more traditional Republican policy, and therefore distrusted by both the America First people and by people on the left, because of the commonalities you mentioned. The third point, though, is the one that I think is politically interesting. Me and lots of other people thought that Trump wouldn't get rid of him because it would seem to be bowing to media pressure and acknowledging the error. Obviously, we were wrong about that, and Trump has gone ahead and done so.
Yeah, the no scalps policy is a real thing. I've talked about it on a couple different shows. The Trump administration takes the position that just because the media calls attention to some scandal or some screw up, the mainstream media, they don't care at all. But in this case, they did care. And of course, it's not just mainstream media who was critical of Mike Waltz for this. Conservative media, independent media, etc. Yep. We will see who gets the job next. Up next, we're making up for the good of the party. James Carville and David Hogg are doing a 180. We will discuss. Stay tuned.
Feud over? The tables have turned in the James Carville-David Hogg saga. The veteran Democratic strategist is backtracking on his previous criticisms of DNC Vice Chair Hogg.
Carville previously railed against Hogg's plan for young progressives to challenge long-seated Democrats in safe districts. He went so far as to call Hogg a contemptible little twerp. Oh, poor David.
Carville took to X to backpedal his previous comments, writing, "Just called David Hogg. He reminded me of the story of after the Battle of Shiloh, Henry Halleck urged President Lincoln to fire Ulysses Grant. Lincoln said, 'I can't fire him. This man fights.' David Hogg fights. The DNC needs him." American Federation of Teachers President Randy Weingarten seconded Carville, saying, "Completely agree. David Hogg is a warrior."
Meanwhile, the DNC could vote to oust David Hogg as vice chair. That's according to exclusive reporting by Semaphor's David Weigel. A Native American DNC member who lost the vice chair race wants a new election citing fairness and gender diversity. The challenge could come as soon as next month. The challenge to David Hogg is just a hilarious example.
You're quite excited about this one, which you told me about 10 minutes ago, and I know nothing about. Tell me about it.
I have to tell you about this. This is an entirely identity politics driven, because there is some requirement, I guess, in the bylaws of the party and the chair race that they have to consider gender and diversity and all that. And so they're trying to argue that the election, this person is making the election of David Hogg, a white dude, we're talking about white dudes a lot today,
yes,
is invalid because it overlooked some gender-based consideration that is baked into the actual procedures that would be totally contrary to the spirit of democracy because they picked someone democratically. So that's all very funny. So David Hogg is fielding a lot of attacks. There's that hilarious attack, and then obviously after he said his organization was going to spend, I think, up to $20 million to primary older, safe Democrats that he thinks are not effective. That made a lot of people upset, including James Carville, who was railing against him. But now I spotted this tweet. They had a little conversation, and I guess they made up. And Randy Weingarten, not my favorite person, ended it with we need David Hogg.
A détente, a rapprochement, perhaps, between Carville and Hogg. I think it is better for Democrats if they don't fight with each other viciously. Carville, who I find an entertaining character, getting into the annoying little twerp stuff. I mean, it's entertaining, but I'm not sure how much good it does to anyone. There is also a broader argument, and I was talking about this with our friend Amber Duke at the end of last week. I mean, Carville obviously is best known for guiding Bill Clinton to victory in 1992, a time when I was almost just leaving high school, so that's a little bit of a time ago. And his argument that the centrist option is always better, that's pretty dubious in some ways. It wasn't better in Hillary Clinton's case, for example. There is some argument to be made, particularly in an increasingly polarized country, that someone who does animate the base actually fares better. And Carville always argues as if it is axiomatically obvious that Clintonite-type candidates would do better than progressive-type candidates. I don't really think that is obvious.
The Clintonite candidate was correct for the 90s, for the time period that just from a political standpoint.
Absolutely.
Centrism, and the centrists are always claiming that more centrism is the right option, but leftists are always claiming that
further to the
leftism is right or ought to be the policy. Where I guess I agree more with the centrists on some things, but then I agree more with the furthest left foreign policy you can go because of horseshoe that starts to overlap with what I think. So I want centrism on areas where I think the Democratic policy is more reasonable, and I want not centrism on some things.
Extremism on the point where it meets with you more closely.
It's just a fancy way of saying I want the things I want the way I want them when I want them.
I would like people who agree with me, please. That would be much better.
This segment is probably as good a place as any to bring up another story I kind of wanted to talk today, but we didn't have time for in its own block, which is, did you see our dear, beloved representative, official representative, even though D.C. has no ability to vote, Eleanor Holmes Norton?
Oh, no. What's this?
Did you see a report yesterday? You didn't see this?
No. Oh, dear.
There was reporting, I believe from Axios, that she would like the oversight job being vacated by Jerry Connolly.
Well, if she takes that would be a bit of a... Why can't AOC come back and take it? She was the best option in the first place.
Well, AOC is not on the committee anymore. She could do it, but she has to wait her turn. I think maybe 60, 70, 80, or 100 years from now, AOC could
get the gavel.
It will be her turn. But right now it's Eleanor Holmes Norton's turn, is what Eleanor Holmes Norton thinks. Eleanor Holmes Norton, of course, is very advanced in age. She's in her late 80s, I believe. I have no issue with her. She's a nice woman. In fact, I've appreciated in the past things she wrote. She wrote something for a conservative news site, I believe National Review, arguing that the barriers around the Capitol as a result of January 6th and everything else are annoying and should come down, to which I completely agreed. They were exactly in my path from getting to Rising on my little scooter path.
Delaying your scooter.
Out of my way. It was outrageous. I will not stand for this injustice. Made me want to attack the Capitol on my way. No, I'm just kidding. We're joking.
Don't do that. We'll have to throw you in prison.
Yes.
Once I resume power.
And then I'll be pardoned once Trump resumes power again. No. So I appreciate Eleanor Holmes Norton. She has no voting power. But I think it would not be a good optics for the vitality of the Democratic Party, its need to attract younger voters, to give yet another very advanced in age person this job.
So you're kind of Team David Hogg on this one to a certain degree.
I am, except that I don't really agree. I don't loathe him. I just don't.
Yeah.
He's not really demonstrated political acumen of his own, to my knowledge, necessarily.
No, I mean, I guess the gun control fight is still the thing that he's most identified with.
But that's always ends up being a losing issue for Democrats.
Well, is that not questionable, Robby? I mean, they have made more progress in that respect. Now, some of that's to do with, like, the NRA has all sorts of internal ructions and has lost some of its power. But over the period that I've lived in the US, which is about 20 years, I think the gun issue has become much less toxic to Democrats and much more debatable who it favors.
Well, they've also lost, gun control provisions have been struck down over and over again over the course of the last 20 years. We have less gun control in the United States than we did when I was born.
Right, but the political impetus for it has actually increased, which is why some of those laws were actually passed by legislatures in the first place, that the public dynamics around it through some, hideous things, including Parkland, which is obviously where David Hogg's identified with, that has changed that.
It seems to me the issue is when there's something horrible happens, there's an immediate desire for something to be done, but the public does not have, I don't think, much of an appetite for the sort of mass confiscation of guns or huge rate that you would really need to do to make a dent in the gun violence problem. They want, maybe they're comfortable with little, background. We're all fine with background checks and little screening things and whatever. It doesn't really change the violence portrait overall, but he could make an argument otherwise. And by the way, we invited him, David Hogg, to call David Hogg, and you can testify.
Yes.
Even when I'm off camera, I'm doing my job. I chased him down to get contact info so we can try to get him on Rising.
Perhaps if he joins, I can make my argument that we should rescind the Second Amendment. I'm sure our viewers would enjoy that.
Wow. Oh, these foreigners coming here, and you're not a Brit, but from the islands,
Europe,
yes.
Socialist Western Europe and their ideas.
Horrifying.
That does it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
See you later.